As Rick's already said, my name's Fergus McDonald, Deputy Director for the DARE UK program, and we'll get into a little bit what that is throughout the talk. So let me just pop my slides up. Can I just get a confirmation? That was the wrong button. Can I just get a confirmation that you can see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Right. Okay, let me just, and I'm getting thumbs up.
Excellent. Full size.
Right. Okay, fantastic. And I think hopefully just to give everyone a bit of context, I thought what I do today is slightly maybe different, maybe not. I saw one of the earlier talks was by the UK Data Service, so my colleague John Sanderson. So maybe some of this is familiar to you, but I thought what it might be useful to do was give a short history of everything TREs. Hopefully I didn't get too many eye rolls from the pun in the title there, but the idea is to talk you through a little bit the last 20 years of trusted research environments, or TREs, in the UK, where it's come from, where it's going, or at least where we think it's going, and how that all relates to sensitive data research in the UK. So before I get into that sort of history, I suppose, I thought it was worth highlighting, and this is something that we've sort of talked about before in various forums, the amount of investment that has actually gone into research using sensitive data. And this is a kind of non-exhaustive list. I'm sure there is far more than this, but really it equates to more than £500 million over the last 15 to 20 years. And I think that's a conservative number. I think there has actually been more than this in the data research ecosystem, and the data research ecosystem that looks at research using sensitive data, right? So there is real investment in this space, and I'm going to focus today on, I guess, the three hats that I wear, which is sort of representing HDR UK, Health Data Research UK, ADR UK, which is Administrative Data Research UK. I'll get into each of these. And then DARE UK, which is the Data Analytics Research Environments Program, a nice long name there. And I'll sort of explain the relationship between the three of these so that hopefully that makes sense before we get into a history of all things trusted research environments in the UK. So just a quick introduction. These will just be sort of very high level one-sliders. And of course, I will not really do them justice because there is, as I'm sure is the same for everyone, a lot underneath this. But really the vision and mission for Health Data Research UK is to enhance public health and to ensure that large-scale data and advanced analytics benefits every patient interaction, every clinical trial, and drives biomedical discovery. And so it's really the National Institute for Health Data Science in the UK. It provides leadership to fix some pretty difficult, knotty challenges in the system. And these are really systemic challenges, right? So it is really trying to drive systemic change in the ecosystem. And fundamentally, it's about this journey that you see here, which is really the researcher journey, all the way from finding data to accessing it through to the other side, which is, you know, deriving the insights, and hopefully insights that can influence and change policy and practice and ultimately improve health. So it is trying to smooth that researcher journey at a systemic level in the UK. In terms of what that sort of means one level down, this is still, I know, very, very high level, but that's the time we've got today. It's about fundamentally three things. Can we sort the data in order to accelerate trustworthy data use? Can we unlock the power of data to improve people's lives? This is really about the need to collaborate and partner across the UK in order to do this. This is not something that sort of any single organization or entity can do. And then shaping the future of health data research is really looking at, in some sense, how is technology impacting health data research in the UK, I guess globally as well, but also what are some of the determinants of health that are emerging that are less obvious or have been less obvious historically. So as we know, there are many determinants of health. Some of those are social, some of them are to do with government services. So it's how do we bring in all of these other data sources to inform and shape the future of how we do health data research in the UK. And it is a single institute that is distributed across the UK, and I think this is quite important. So this is actually not a bricks and mortar institute. It's a completely virtual institute with essentially leadership from across the 4 nations in the UK and across the regions of the UK as well, which I guess is relevant for for this group, the N8 group as well. So that's HDR UK. That's all I'm going to say there for today. In terms of ADR UK, I would sort of roughly equate. I think Emma would not. Emma Gordon is the director of ADR UK. I don't think it would be unfair to say that ADR UK and HDR UK are in some sense sister programs, where ADR UK, or Administrative Data Research UK, is looking at how to make linked administrative data accessible for research in the public good. So really, administrative data in this context is the kind of data that is generated by our interactions with public services, whether that be the school system, the courts, tax system, the NHS, for example. And I think you can see here a kind of natural synergy, the NHS being an example, a natural synergy or interest, shared interest between ADR UK and HDR UK at the boundary of administrative data and what we would call health data. I think there are obvious connections to be made there, and some very interesting intersectional questions that researchers would like to tackle at that boundary. So that's what ADR UK is. And then I'll come to DARE UK, which is my primary hat. And then I will explain, hopefully make sense, the connection between the three to you. DARE UK is a program funded through UKRI. So I guess I always sort of say there's 4 touch points to the scope of the program. The first is it's about sensitive data across research domains. So we are sort of agnostic to, let's call it the data domain, or perhaps the traditional research domain, whether that health research, administrative data research, environmental data research, smart data research, the data that you get from wearables. We're agnostic really to the research domain. Our concern is whether the data is sensitive, and that predominantly for us, although we do have some scope that bleeds into commercial elements of sensitivity, it is really about data that affects people, communities, and populations. So that's the first sort of touch point of the scope. The second is about trying to answer intersectional research questions. So it is about looking across these more traditional, somewhat siloed, I would say, research domains, and try to say, can we link data from, for example, health and administrative data? Can we link it together to answer some very interesting, knotty, intersectional research questions where you need both, or you need all 3 sort of types of data or sources of data, etc. Right? So it is really about trying to do data linkage across these domains. The third is we are an infrastructure program, and this is a little bit going to go into now what my talk is actually about when I get there. But we are fundamentally about trusted research environments and making trusted research environments, or TREs, fit for the future in servicing the emerging needs of research. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. And then the final thing is, this is all obviously to enable research in the public good, right? So this is fundamentally about public good research that will influence changes in public policy for the UK population. I'm not really going to necessarily read through the vision and mission here. Again, the slides can be shared afterwards, but there's the vision and mission if you want to get the strap line, so to speak. And just in terms of the relationship then, just the connection here. As I said, DARE UK is funded by UKRI, so we are pan-UKRI. That is essentially a proxy for we are agnostic to the data domain, right? So we operate across all research councils, and we're delivered by, because we are not our own legal entity, we are delivered by HDR UK and ADR UK in partnership. So for example, I am an HDR UK employee, even though I run this independent program called DARE UK. Just so there's a sense of the relationship and why I'm wearing 3 hats, I guess, in a way here. Okay, so that's a little bit of context about me, I suppose, but also the background for this short history I'm going to walk you through. I think there are 2 other things that I need to share with you. I wasn't sure how familiar the audience was with the space, so I think there's 2 concepts that I think are important to get across as well. When we, and I'm using the royal we here, when we in the space that we come from talk about sensitive data research, the 5 SAFE framework, the link is here, which was developed by the Office for National Statistics, is the framework for how, it's sort of a set of principles or a risk management approach for how we enable safe and ethical access to sensitive data for research, right? And I'm going to talk you through these, pretty briefly. Of course, at this level, they do sound relatively sensible and straightforward, and they are. But I guess at the actual implementation level, this can get quite complex. So the first is safe people. Can the user be trusted to use the data in an appropriate manner? And this refers to, training. Do you have the appropriate skill set to do the kind of research you're looking for using sensitive data? Have you got the necessary ethical training? All these sorts of things about the researcher and their suitability to be doing this kind of research with sensitive data. The second is safe projects. This is essentially, is your purpose appropriate, lawful, ethical, and sensible? It captures the purpose of the project, right? Is this in the public interest and lawful, ethical, and sensible, right? The safe setting, which is what we're going to talk about in a bit more detail, and I'm going to give you the history of the safe setting, is the facility, the access facility that manages the use of sensitive data for research and mitigates against unauthorized use or mistakes. And very often these are mistakes more than unauthorized use. So that's really the trusted research environment, the safe setting, and I'll touch on that shortly. Safe data. Does the data itself contain sufficient information to allow confidentiality to be breached, right? So this is really making sure that it's essentially data minimization. It's essentially saying, what is the minimum set of data that you need for your specified purpose, your safe project, in order to ensure that we are reducing as much as we can any risks of a kind of confidentiality breach in the data. And again, it should be said that all of this data that is accessed in trusted research environments is already pseudonymized, right? So this means sort of personal identifiers have already been stripped out. And then finally, safe outputs. When you've done your research and you are looking to publish essentially, or take out the findings from the research, whatever those findings might be, how do we ensure that those outputs, before they are made available on the positively hostile and open internet, how can we make sure that confidentiality is maintained in the outputs as well, right? So that's what safe outputs is. So I just think it's important. That's sort of, I think that concept of the 5 safe is really important. And I think the next one is then, what is a TRE anyway? Because I think people have mixed understandings at times of what a trusted research environment is. I think the easiest way to do this is to talk about what a normal research computing environment looks like. So you've got some kit somewhere, hopefully it's some nice fancy, I don't know, GPUs. And if you're less lucky, maybe you've got some smaller, older CPUs, I don't know. But you've got some hardware, you've got some data sitting on top of that hardware, you've got some software that you use to interact with that, and you're pretty free to do so as you like, right? So you're a researcher, you can come in and out, you can sort of download the software you want, you can import and export data as you like, and it's a pretty sort of free-flowing way of working, and there are thousands of these across the UK, right? And again, fundamentally, why this works is because you have open access to the internet, right? You're very flexible as a researcher in what you can do to try to answer the questions which you're trying to answer. And that means also that it's very easy to, I say very easy, it's relatively easy to collaborate, right? So if you want to collaborate across different, let's call them data silos or research computing environments, each holding data, it's pretty easy to do because again, you can access the internet openly and with relative ease. And so what we kind of call federated projects, projects where you are trying to run analysis on different sort of data silos, it's relatively easy to do in general computing, research computing environments because of that open access to the internet. Fundamentally, what a TRE does is it breaks that open access to the internet. You do not have open access to the internet. It is a highly controlled access to the internet using, essentially these environments are air-gapped. They're air-gapped in sort of technical terms to the internet. And what this fundamentally does is breaks a lot of the off-the-shelf solutions that exist. And it means that there needs to be innovative engineering i.e. trusted research environments, but there needs to be innovative engineering to enable a researcher still answer the questions they want to, while balancing that with mitigating the risks of either intentional or unintentional disclosure of personal information. And I think it's really important to say that I think there's sometimes an impression that this is sort of relatively easy to do. You could just sort of, the IT department at your university could just do this. That's not the case. Trusted research environments are complex environments to run, and they need a dedicated specialist approach to doing so. This isn't just something that you bolt on to existing research computing infrastructure. So the TRE, and then we'll finally get into the history piece here, the history of everything TREs. But the final thing is, this is fundamentally what a TRE is. So within that secure boundary, it hosts the data, again, pseudonymized data. It provides a subset of that pseudonymized data, again, a subset because it will only provide the minimum data required to answer the research question that the researcher is trying to answer. You don't get all the data to play around with. You only get the subset that you need. It provides that secure analytical environment where a researcher is able to do their analysis, to manipulate the data they've been provided. Of course, there are restrictions on this because, again, you will not be able to bring in any software package you like. It's what is provided by the trusted research environment. And then at the very boundary, once you're sort of done and you want to disclose or publish, I suppose, your research findings, there is a disclosure control process. So this is this is essentially TRE teams looking at the outputs you're proposing to publish or take out of the security boundary and deciding whether actually there's a risk this is disclosive and we need you to make some mitigation. So, for example, I don't know, your count here is less than 10 in this data set, and that means we think that's a bit too risky, and so we need you to lift that up. So, and there are various kind of disclosure mechanisms which we won't get into here. So fundamentally, that's what a TRE is. It is the safe setting. So in the context of the 5 safes which I introduced earlier, it is the safe setting, it is the facility that enables researchers access to sensitive data. But of course, it applies a lot of constraints on researchers, again, to mitigate the risk of disclosure. Okay, I hope that all made sense. So if we get into then a sort of the short history here, really what this has been is a journey over roughly the last 20 years. Some would argue, and maybe if John was still here from the UK Data Service, he might argue that they've been around longer than 20 years as a TRE. But over the last 20 years, really the journey has been from distribution to access. So previously, when it came to sensitive data research, it was effectively a download model, right? The researcher was able to download this data to their devices, and they basically had a very hands-on, very free way of working with the data in order to answer the questions they were trying to answer. Now, of course, there were a lot of protections wrapped around that. There were legal agreements. There were a lot of things that a researcher had to sign in order to be able to do so. But fundamentally, the data was with the researcher, right? They had the data. And we're moving to a model of data access. I mean, we're well into a model of data access where it essentially inverts that approach. So rather than the data going to where their researcher is, the researcher needs to go to where the data lives. There are various reasons for that. A big driver, of course, is that it is simply safer and more secure to do it that way. But there are other considerations like data scale. At a certain size of data, you just cannot be shipping it around, right? Imaging, these sort of things. So there is a good reason why that model has flipped around, not only for the purposes of maintaining the safety and security of the data itself. And the UK has a strong track record, but I guess what I would sort of, what I think, this is sort of a, now I'm getting into kind of the storytelling of the history. So obviously I will, as with all history, get parts of this wrong. But I think there were sort of 3 distinct phases over the last 20 years. The first was a sort of competitive phase where TREs sort of were popping up, and it was seen essentially they grew on top of data silos, And there was a sort of, I've got the data and you don't have this data. And there's a little bit of competition around who had the data and thus was able to do the research using that data. And so TREs had and still to some extent do have a bit of a competitive, they compete with one another in some sense. But and this was starting to happen pre-pandemic, but it was really accelerated by the pandemic, and I'm sure for very obvious reasons, we are in a phase where there's really a desire to collaborate, right? And to collaborate where it makes sense to answer the kind of research questions that researchers are looking to answer, and that no single TRE on its own can facilitate answering. And then I'll touch at the very end on a little bit what we think the future looks like, which is to federate, and we'll get into what federation is a little bit later. But this is sort of the journey I'm going to try to take you on, and give you a bit of a sense of trusted research environments in the UK. So this was actually a survey done. This was where are we now? 2025. This will be end of 2023 that we did the survey, and actually we've just done the latest round, so there should be a refresh coming in the next couple of months. And this was essentially trying to give you a picture of the number of TREs in the UK over the last roughly 20 years. And I guess the overall message is trending upwards. Now, this is by no means the sort of an exhaustive list, if you like. There are far more TREs than the 40 that you see here. This is just who responded to our survey, but we probably estimate that we're in the region of around 100 TREs in the UK, more or less at the moment. Acknowledging again that these are quite specialized, costly, complex operations to run. And so in this sort of competitive phase, which again, I think is roughly up until about 2020, 2021, we see a number of trusted research environments. I've put a couple here up on the screen just to give you a sense of who existed from an organization point of view in this period. You can see the UK Data Service here. You can see UK Biobank, the Office for National Statistics, the Sale Data Bank in Wales. So many of the, at least in our world, let's call them sort of well-established usual suspects to some extent, right? And I hope you will see how this picture starts to get a bit more complicated as we move along. And I think it's always worth sort of highlighting a couple of things that happen at a policy level that influence kind of this journey from distribution to access. So I think a big one that should be highlighted is the Digital Economy Act of 2017, and particularly Chapter 5, which was the sharing of essentially public data, if you like, or data generated through public services and for running public services for research purposes. And this is sort of the legal gateway, or one of the legal gateways that allowed access to this kind of data for research. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic hit. So I've skipped over a lot here. I'm going to go into quite a lot of detail in the collaboration bit, which is this piece now. But really what kicked this all off was the COVID-19 pandemic and the realization that actually we really need to be collaborating here, because we cannot answer the kind of questions the pandemic is throwing at us as a society if we don't. And so what you see here is the same picture that I showed you before, but it's starting to get a little bit busier. There are new players coming in, not just driven by the pandemic, but in part driven by the pandemic. And we start to see commercial players coming in as well. Right, so we see GCP, we see AWS, we see Azure starting to look at trusted research environments. They may not have called them trusted research environments, but starting to look at TREs as an offering that they can make. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of things that emerged in this kind of collaboration period of the journey, or sort of period of the history. And I'm going to do this from very purely a kind of health data research and DARE UK lens, because that's the lens that I have. So no doubt I will be forgetting or leaving out other developments in this history, as with all histories. So again, in that collaboration vein, what we start to see emerging is the establishment of, for example, the UK Health Data Research Alliance, excuse me, which is a membership organization who really come together in a number of different areas to push forward a kind of collaborative community-led approach to how we do research using sensitive data, health data in this case, pardon me, in the UK. What does that actually look like? So it's, writing green papers and white papers. This is sort of roughly 2020, 2021. These were colleagues of mine, about trusted research environments. How do you build them? What are they actually? We start to come together around standards, right? So we start to develop working groups. We start to look at all kinds of standards, not just data standards. So for example, in the health data research world, this would be the OMOP common data model as a kind of data standard for standardizing the way that we do health data research. But also, I suppose some might say, slightly less exciting, but I would argue very, very important, standards around contracts, around data access agreements, around template data contributor agreements, around standards for data use registries. How do we show on the public record how data is being used for research, by whom and for what purpose? So there is this kind of coming together of the health data research community, not just the health data research community, but driven through COVID, largely that community, around agreeing on standards and standard ways of doing things rather than reinventing the wheel every time. And one such example of a group, the Pan-UK Data Governance Steering Group, looking at all of the information governance and legal gateway challenges that exist in the legislation and in the interpretation of that legislation to enable access to health data for research. And I threw this slide up because, again, knowing the audience I'm talking to here, I imagine you may see at least one or two of the N8 organizations in here. I see Sheffield. I'm sure there are others involved as well. And again, trying to surface the real challenges that the community is facing as a collaborative effort in, for example, data governance, right? So this was essentially the ask here was, what's the tube map if I were to try and navigate the data access approval process I need to get to be able to finally actually have access to the data so I can do my research? It's an incredibly complex picture. I think this paper on the left here, I can't remember, I think it was 2 years, maybe 2.5 years before a researcher actually had access to do the data research they wanted to. Obviously, by that time, I'm pretty sure their PhD was over. So it's just to give a sense of the kind of things that were being tackled collaboratively as a community. We see the community coming together around how can we do better, more consistent, joined up engagement with the public, because of course, public involvement and engagement in this space is incredibly important. And fundamentally, this is data about people and about the public. It is their data that we are trying to use to deliver benefit for them. We need them to inform us, decide, make decisions with us about how we do that. And we see this kind of coming together again, that the message here is collaboration, partnership. We see organizations coming together in this sort of period of the history to try to coalesce around best practice and the ways that we want to do this as a community. On the technology side, I'm going to talk here about the sort of technology ecosystem at HDR UK, and there are sort of a number of solutions which have been built and developed really for the community. I'm going to kind of skip this slide. The main message here is really that this is about open source, open APIs, and in some cases, open development and co-development, right? And I think it's really important that this is something that HDR UK, in all of the kind of technology development that they do, is that we push this kind of open approach and collaborative approach to developing technology solutions to enable research with health data in this case. So I'm going to skip this one. This is sort of pieces of the ecosystem. I'm going to touch on a couple of just to give some examples, just to give you all a flavor of the kind of things that have emerged over the sort of collaboration period. You have, for example, the gateway, which is really looking at data discovery and trying to support the end-to-end researcher journey, all the way from the kind of feasibility analysis of whether what kind of question are you actually looking to answer, what kind of data is available to do so, all the way through to then actually, okay, this is the data I want to have access to. Where can I find it? How do I put in an application, submit an application to do so? Right, and the gateway, as an example, it really supports, I think, at the moment, over 40,000 sort of users per year, more or less. There are 11,100 metadata data sets captured in the gateway to support that discoverability, with over 100 data custodians making their data available to be discoverable on the gateway. Another tool, for example, in the bottom right is the cohort discovery. Again, this is a tool that's been integrated into the gateway, and effectively this allows sort of a federated query of how many records match a specified criteria. So, for example, if in your research question you're looking for the number of females with asthma who have had a cancer diagnosis in the past 5 years, right? This is the kind of query that you could put into the cohort discovery. It would fire off that query to, again, all of the data custodians that have hosted their data on the gateway, and it will bring you back a kind of effectively account where that data all sits. And this just supports high-level feasibility analysis, but also potentially recruitment for clinical trials, which is a really important area here as well, and is actually a declining area in the UK, but let's not get into that. The Safe People Registry is another example. So this is, again, you remember I mentioned Safe People as a kind of part of the 5 Safes framework. So this is really a registry that tries to not make decisions. It just tries to surface the information that data custodians or the responsible people need in order to decide whether a researcher is safe and appropriate for doing research on sensitive data, or the data that they've requested to do research on. I'm going to leave it there just in the interest of time. There is a lot underneath all of this, but I'm just going to move on because I think I'm probably behind. So that was sort of HDR UK, and again, we're in this kind of collaborative, we need to work together, we need to work with partnership sort of phase of the history here of trusted research environments. I'm going to touch then on DARE UK now, which is the program that I lead. And I mean, the only real point in this slide is to say it started roughly in July 2021. So again, right at the kind of cusp of that collaboration movement in this history I'm trying to give you. This is when we were formed, and we're currently in phase 2 of the program. And I think what's really important about DARE UK to emphasize is, again, in the context of this collaborative period of history we're in, what we don't and what we do. And I think this is just important, right? So what DARE UK does not do is build services, product, or proof of concepts. There are others who do that. HDR UK, for example, as I've just sort of spoken through, do that. And there are various others who do this. We don't do that because we don't need more of that. But we fundamentally try to fund and collaborate with partners who do build them, right? So it's a partnership model. We don't develop and define new standards. And I hope everyone had a bit of a chuckle at that XKCD clip from earlier. We have enough standards, so let's work with what we've got. Let's improve and adopt existing standards rather than develop and define new ones. We don't operate as a centralized organization. Again, partnership, collaboration, in tune with sort of where we are in my history here of trusted research environments. It's about working in partnership across the UK. And again, quite DARE sort of specific here, and I've mentioned this already, but we don't work within a specific research domain. We work across various sensitive data domains. And what is DARE UK trying to do? Again, I'm going to have to keep it relatively high level here, just in the interest of time. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is put the infrastructure in place to make it possible. And infrastructure here doesn't just mean technical infrastructure. This means governance infrastructure, organizational infrastructure in terms of standard operating procedures, best practice. So infrastructure is not just technical. In order to make the kind of research we're trying to enable researchers to do possible, training and tools to make it easier. communities, and we do a lot of community building, and this is really, really important to make it normative, to make it normal, to share good practice, to learn from each other. And on the right-hand side, this is perhaps not something we've tackled hugely so far, but I think that is sort of coming up more and more. And this is discussions that we have with UKRI, but how do we incentivize this kind of change we're looking for? How do we make it rewarding? And potentially, in some areas, how do we make it required? How do we make it policy? So in phase 1 of DARE UK, this was really focused on kind of the make it possible, make it normal, right? Community building and sort of some early testing in the infrastructure space about what's possible. Again, I will share all of these slides with you, but fundamentally phase 1 was trying to understand the challenge space, trying to understand where DARE UK could add the most value, and exploring in a very kind of proof of concept, early exploration way, how we could look to start doing that in the future, right? Again, all these links, I'm happy to share the slides afterwards. You can look at all these links. Where we are at the moment is then in phase 2. So what are we trying to do here? Again, it's still about making it possible, still really focused on community building and bringing the community together around shared challenges, but increasingly trying to look at training and tools to make it easier. And phase 2 is fundamentally about, these words aren't always the best, but intra-TRE capabilities. That means individual trusted research environments. How do we support them to become fit for purpose for the future and to support their researchers to do what their researchers want to do? And inter-TRE capabilities. And this is really about how TREs, trusted research environments, work together to support researchers to do what are at the moment quite challenging research questions to answer for many, many reasons. So this is fundamentally how do we do federated analysis across TREs in the UK. I'm going to go through very rapidly, and again, I'll share this. You can go look at, you can scan these codes and go through the detail. So what is that from a DARE UK perspective? There are TREvolution is the name of, again, a group of partners who are our builders and developers. So they're looking at some of these TRE capabilities. For example, how do we do federated analysis? Or how do we actually begin to introduce AI models into trusted research environments to work using sensitive data? More importantly, how would we ever let that AI model out of a trusted research environment safely and securely? How can we start to define what a TRE actually is in a kind of detailed architecture, if you like? How do we define what a TRE is anyway? And we have, for example, developed standards, the sort of SARTRA specification, standard architecture for TREs. We developed the SARTRA specification, which is being picked up across Europe as well. And how do we start to automate some of what are very manual processes in trusted research environments, right? So this is kind of what TREvolution is in phase 2. It's kind of our builders, our developers, and they're our kind of core partners. The second component is really early adopters. How can we bring trusted research environments or secure data environments, they're sometimes called in the NHS sort of world, how can we bring them on board with us to basically test, configure, and adopt these capabilities that our partners above are building and developing, right? How can we get them in as early adopters to, tell us whether these work for them or what needs to be adjusted in these TRE environments? Because as I said, trusted research environments are not standard research computing environments. So it's our sort of early adopter cohort. We then actually have a call open at the moment, which is for research exemplars. And this is really, okay, we've built them. We've built these capabilities. We've tested them, configured them, adopted them. They actually run in the trusted research environments we're talking about. Are they actually useful, right? So the research exemplars are trying to invite researchers to try to do science with the capabilities we've developed alongside the early adopter partners we have to see whether they actually work, right? Are they actually useful for researchers? Do they make it easier? Do they improve the science? Do they speed it up? So that's what the research exemplars are, and there is actually a call open at the moment for these. Our community groups, which is really, again, about sharing best practice, about doing open science. And again, we provide modest resource, actually. So we provide funding to various community groups. We have different sort of kinds of groups to come together and coalesce around shared interests, shared challenges in the sensitive data research space. And then we have what we sort of call the kind of innovators, but this is really, we see some of the emerging challenges in trusted research environments and sensitive data more broadly. I just mentioned one of them, which was how are we dealing with AI model training on sensitive data research? How can those models be released safely and ensure that they are not disclosive to the participants whose data they've been trained on? So the innovators are really looking at some of the emerging challenges we see here and testing, building proof of concepts and piloting approaches to how we could address that in trusted research environments in the UK. And then the final thing is public involvement and engagement, of course, is wrapped into all of this, right? So we mandate it across, well, not only for ourselves, but across all of our partners and all of the activities that you see here. There is mandatory public involvement and engagement that takes different forms based on the activities that are happening. And I guess what I wanted to call out here, just for this group and for the N8, again, I don't know if that's the way you use this, the N8, but you know, the northern 8 research-intensive universities, is that you are involved in some of these already, right? So if I look at Treevolution, these are the sort of the leads themselves and the lead organizations, but Manchester heavily involved here, right? So already involved in what we're doing at DARE UK. If we look at the early adopter cohort, this is them. So you can see that Sheffield is involved here, Liverpool is involved here. So again, just calling out that actually the N8 is involved in the DARE UK program to date in various areas. Okay, so we're back to this picture. So I've kind of given you the compete and collaborate, and again, that collaborate period was a kind of, there was a lot we could have got into. I've tried to give you a bit of a surface level view of what was happening from an HDR UK and DARE UK perspective. I'm sure that I'm forgetting other perspectives, right? But I don't have them for this history lesson. But the question is then, what does the future look like, right? So that's kind of the previous 20 years. What does the next 20 years look like in this distribution to access journey? And again, calling out some of the, I guess, the policy work that is pointing us in that direction. You can see things like the Data Use and Access Bill, which was passed this year. You see things like the Goldacre Review. This is the bottom right-hand corner, the Goldacre Review, the Sudler Review, pointing towards trusted research environments and the need to connect them across the UK. You look at initiatives like the government's announcement about a health data research service, £600 million investment, significant investment. What does that mean? You look at the National Data Library, another initiative out of government, looking at how to open up access to, again, government administrative data and public services data. I think there's sort of 100 million in funding earmarked for that. The Data That Saves Lives strategy of 2022. So there's all these, you know, policies, I suppose, setting a direction of travel. And for us, that direction of travel is federation, because there is no scenario that we can envisage where all of the data is going to be in one place. There are various reasons why that will just never happen. Least of all that it shouldn't happen for reasons of trustworthiness and demonstrating that trustworthiness to the publics. But really, this is where we see the future direction. We see it as federation, the ability to connect secure data silos across the UK, trusted research environments across the UK, across the 4 nations of the UK in a way that is safe and trustworthy to the public. I am coming to the end here. I don't know if I'm over time or not, Rick, but I'm coming to the end. And we can sort of see federation start to happen anyway. It is naturally happening. So if you look at, for example, the National Health Service in England, there is a network. It's called the Subnational Secure Data Environment Network, forming. It has already formed, right? It's still pretty early on, but it's already formed. We can already see on the right-hand side that the Scottish Safe Havens is another word for TRE in Scotland. The Scottish Safe Havens are operating as a federated network. We can see When it comes to the smart data research world, that's the one in the middle. We can already see these smart data research data services are operating as, to some degree, a network. So we're starting to see federated networks of trusted research environments, connected secure data environments emerging in the UK. And it's not just the UK. So we're starting to see this in Europe. The European health data space, for example, has actually passed a regulation that means it is law. You will be required to share or make available health data across the nations in Europe, right? It is law, or it will be law. I guess they have a timeline to implement it, but it will be law. And again, they reference a lot of the work that we in the UK have done, right? So Europe is looking to the UK because we are actually ahead in the space, right? And so the UK is ahead of the curve, but I think it's important to point out that the world is catching up. Europe certainly is looking to the UK and drawing on our experience, our long experience here with trusted research environments and doing research on sensitive data securely, safely, and in a way that demonstrates trust. But we do need to try and stay ahead of that curve. And actually, as I close it off, so I'm done now. That's the end of the talk. I'll stop sharing. But just on that one, talking about Europe, I think I've just seen actually a blog that went out, and I'll put it in the chat, from AWS, Amazon, talking about trusted research environments and what they can offer. And so there is significant interest in the concept of TREs, and the UK is ahead of the curve here, and we need to maintain our position there. That's it for me. I hope that was a engaging and interesting brief history of everything TRE.